The storm raged outside, but inside the old mansion, silence ruled, except for the portrait. Hung above the fireplace, it was supposed to be nothing more than paint and canvas, a family frozen in time. But at midnight, their smiles shifted. The father's eyes darkened. The mother's lips curled into a grin that wasn't hers. And the children's faces melted into strangers. At first, the family thought it was their imagination. Shadows, bad lighting, or maybe too much wine before bed. But when the youngest child whispered, "That man in the portrait winked at me," everything changed. Each night, the faces grew less human, twisted, hollow. Sometimes, one of the living family members' faces appeared in the frame, staring back in terror, begging for help. And by the time they realized the portrait wasn't just changing, it was choosing, it was already too late. That, though old and draped in dust, carried a strange charm. Grand staircases, tall windows, and a fireplace crowned with an enormous family portrait. The painting showed a stern father, a gentle mother, and two children, frozen in timeless perfection. No one knew who they were, and the realtor avoided questions about the family who once lived there. From the first night, something felt off. The air carried a weight, as if the walls themselves were watching. The children complained that the eyes in the portrait followed them through the room. The mother admitted she felt uneasy, though she brushed it off as nerves. But the father noticed details no one else did. A faint crack near the boy's mouth, a shadow that didn't belong. And one night, as the clock struck 12, he swore the painted girl's lips moved, whispering a name he had never heard. Mansion for barely a week when the first change appeared. At dinner, little Sophie dropped her fork and stared at the portrait above the fireplace. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "The boy in the painting, he's smiling at me." Her father, Richard, frowned. "He's always smiling. It's just paint, sweetheart." But when Richard turned his eyes to the portrait, the painted boy's lips seemed thinner than before, stretched as though caught in a sly grin. He shook his head. Old paintings crack and shift. Nothing more. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, the family gathered in the living room. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the walls. Eleanor, the mother, caught herself staring at the mother in the portrait. Something was different. The eyes, they weren't soft anymore. They looked hollow, sharp, and fixed directly on her. She blinked. Gone. Normal again. She knew it wasn't. The second night brought no comfort. At exactly midnight, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 12. The sound echoed through the empty halls, and with it came a whisper, faint, drawn out, like a breath pressed against glass. Sophie woke first. She tiptoed into the living room, clutching her blanket, and froze. The portrait had changed. The painted father's eyes were no longer brown. They were pitch black, glistening with something that looked wet. His smile had twisted into something cruel, something predatory. And the painted mother's face, her lips were cracked open, as if caught mid-scream. Sophie's tiny voice cracked. "Mommy!" Eleanor rushed in, pulling Sophie into her arms. Her gaze snapped to the painting, and her blood ran cold. "Richard!" she screamed. Within seconds, Richard appeared, half asleep, his robe dragging across the floor. His eyes followed Eleanor's trembling finger toward the portrait. He swore the painted boy had Sophie's face, her exact face, the same golden curls, the same wide eyes, except these eyes were drowning in terror, pressed against the canvas as though begging to be released. "No," Richard muttered. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But when he blinked, the boy's face was back. Ordinary, painted, innocent. Morning light did nothing to erase the dread. The Harringtons searched for answers, checking the frame, touching the brushstrokes, even asking the realtor about the mansion's history. The realtor's reply was cold and clipped. "That painting has always hung there," she said. "No one touches it. No one dares." And then she ended the call. The third night was worse. The Harringtons huddled in the bedroom, but Richard couldn't resist. He crept downstairs, his candle barely keeping the shadows away. The house was silent, except for the soft tick of the clock. The portrait no longer held strangers. It held them. He saw himself in the father's place, except older, gaunter, with skin pulled tight against bone. Eleanor stood beside him, her painted face drained of all warmth, her eyes lifeless. Sophie and her brother, Thomas, clutched each other in the painting, their mouths wide with silent screams. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His candle flickered, nearly dying. And then, for the first time, the painted Richard turned his head just slightly, just enough to let Richard know he was aware of being watched. Richard stumbled back, heart pounding, knocking over a chair. The sound woke Eleanor, who found him trembling, staring up at the canvas. His voice broke as he whispered, "It was us. The portrait showed us." Eleanor grabbed his arm. "We're leaving tomorrow. I don't care what it takes." But deep down, Richard knew something Eleanor didn't. The portrait wasn't just changing, it was pulling them in, piece by piece. And by the time they tried to leave, the house might not let them. The morning after Richard's terrifying discovery, the Harringtons tried to act as though nothing had happened. They ate breakfast in silence, the children unusually quiet, their eyes darting nervously toward the living room. The portrait loomed in the next room, heavy and suffocating, even when unseen. Eleanor tried to keep the family together. "It's just stress," she said. She whispered to herself as she packed lunches for the children. But when she closed her eyes, she could still see her own painted reflection staring back from the canvas. Cold, lifeless, trapped. That afternoon, she went to the local library. The mansion was old. Surely there must be records. She searched newspapers, dusty archives, anything with mention of the house or the painting. Hours later, her hands trembling, she found it. A headline, faded with time. Local painter murders. The article told the story of Edward Green, a reclusive painter known for portraits so realistic, locals swore the eyes followed them. He was commissioned to paint his own family. But when the work was complete, the faces in the painting were not serene. They were twisted, distorted, screaming. Edward was found hanging, his eyes gouged out, a brush still clutched in his hand. The painting disappeared after that, until now. Eleanor's blood turned cold. She snapped the book shut and fled the library. That night, she told Richard everything. His face darkened. "So the portrait is cursed." "Richard, it's more than cursed. It's a prison. That man painted his family into it. And now," her voice cracked, "it's happening to us." Their courage faltered. The family gathered in the living room. Richard held an oil lamp, ready to set the canvas aflame. Eleanor clutched Sophie and Thomas close. The portrait stared back, unchanged. For now. Richard stepped forward. "You won't take my family." He raised the lamp, and the painting changed before their eyes. The flames reflected in the glass, and for a moment, they saw themselves burning inside the portrait. Richard froze. He heard his own voice, distorted, echoing from the canvas. "Burn it, Richard. Burn us alive," the children screamed. Eleanor pulled them back, tears streaming down her face. "Stop! Don't!" Richard dropped the lamp, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The flames snuffed out, leaving only the sound of the clock ticking. The portrait had won, for now. Over the next nights, the changes grew worse. One evening, Thomas vanished. The boy had gone to bed as usual, clutching his toy soldier. The sheets cold. She screamed his name, searching every room. The house was locked. No windows open. No signs of struggle. And then, Sophie pointed to the living room. "Mommy," she whispered, shaking. "He's in the picture." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. She turned, and there he was. The painted boy in the portrait was no longer a stranger. It was Thomas. His little hands pressed against the inside of the canvas, his mouth open in a silent cry. The toy soldier was clutched against his chest. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "No! Give him back! Please!" Richard pounded his fists against the frame, his voice breaking. "Take me instead!" The portrait remained silent, the painted Thomas, trapped behind the glass, his eyes wide with terror. From that moment on, the Harringtons realized escape was impossible. They tried to leave. Richard packed the car, shoving bags in, but when they turned the key, the engine refused to start. Richard slammed the steering wheel, cursing, his voice raw. He stepped out, only to find the house standing taller, darker, as if mocking them. And then Sophie gasped, "Daddy, look!" Through the upstairs window, the portrait glowed faintly. Thomas's painted face was there, staring down at them, his tiny hand pressed to the glass, as if begging them not to leave. Eleanor's scream tore through the night. Back inside, desperation consumed them. They tore through books, searched for answers, begged God for mercy. Richard even found Edward Crane's signature etched into the frame, a mocking flourish. Crane wanted immortality, Richard whispered. He trapped his family in the portrait, and now he's trapping us. Eleanor's voice shook. If he trapped them, maybe we can set them free. But how? The neck with black veins spreading across her skin. Her painted mouth opened slowly, and though no sound came, Richard swore he could read her lips. "Join us," Sophie wailed, clutching Eleanor tightly. "Don't let them take you, Mommy." Eleanor held her daughter, whispering soothing words, though her own tears betrayed her. Richard stared at the canvas, his fists clenched. He knew the truth. One by one, the painting would claim them all, unless he found a way to break it. For the first time in weeks, Richard prayed. He dropped to his knees before the fire, begging for strength. The room felt colder, heavier, as though unseen eyes watched from every shadow. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint, coming from the portrait itself. "Finish what was begun." Richard raised his head. Edward Crane's face flickered faintly in the background of the painting. His eyeless socket, the portrait, was incomplete, and the Harringtons were meant to finish it with their souls. By dawn, Eleanor found Richard sitting before the canvas, unblinking, a brush in his hand. "Richard," she whispered, terrified. "What are you doing?" His voice was hollow, distant. "If I complete it, maybe it will let Thomas go. Maybe it will let us all go." Eleanor snatched the brush away, screaming. "That's what Crane thought, and look what happened to his family." But Richard only smiled, a broken, desperate smile. "We don't have a choice anymore." The portrait pulsed, alive, as though agreeing. And from within, Thomas's painted eyes filled with tears. The Harrington house no longer felt like a home. By the third week, it had become a coffin, walls groaning with unseen weight, air thick with whispers, and the portrait dominating every corner of their lives. Eleanor barely slept. She spent nights clutching Sophie, whispering prayers until her voice went hoarse. The house seemed to smother faith. Richard, meanwhile, grew obsessed. He sat for hours in front of the portrait, sketching, muttering to himself, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. Sometimes Eleanor would shake him, but he only whispered, "It's not finished. It needs us." One night, as thunder cracked outside and rain slammed against the windows, the curse reached its peak. The clock struck midnight. The sound echoed unnaturally, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very floorboards. The fire in the hearth died suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. Except for the glow, the portrait was glowing. Not softly, but violently, as the lightning had been captured within it. The painted faces flickered and writhed, their mouths stretching in silent screams. Thomas's painted body pressed desperately against the inside of the canvas. His toy soldier painted beside Thomas, pale and hollow-eyed, lips moving silently. "Join us." Richard stepped forward, his body trembling. "They want us. They're not getting us," Eleanor snapped, clutching Sophie tighter. But before she could stop him, Richard grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it at the portrait. The glass shattered, and the room exploded in screams. It wasn't just sound, it was them. The painted figures poured out of the frame, twisted and distorted. The painted mother stepped forward first, her skin cracked like dried paint, eyes oozing black liquid. The painted father followed, his mouth stretching unnaturally wide, jaw snapping as though broken. Their painted hands reached, dripping with oil that smoked as it touched the floor. "Richard," Eleanor gasped, pulling Sophie back. "Don't look at them!" But Richard was frozen, staring in horror as his painted doppelganger climbed out of the canvas. An older, rotting version of him. Richard swung the poker again, but it passed through the painted figure as though through smoke. The figure only laughed, a wet, choking sound that rattled the air. The room began to warp. The walls twisted, colors bleeding, as though the entire house had become a canvas. The staircase melted, the windows stretched, and the air itself thickened like wet paint. Sophie screamed. Eleanor clutched her, stumbling backward, but the door was gone, painted shut against the wall. "Richard!" Eleanor cried. "It's taking the whole house." But Richard wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Thomas, inside the portrait, who was banging against the glass, his painted mouth screaming silently. "I can save him," Richard whispered, his voice shaking. "I can trade places. I have to." "No!" Eleanor screamed. She grabbed his arm, desperate. "That's what it wants." But it was too late. Richard pressed his hand to the portrait. The canvas rippled like water. And before Eleanor could pull him away, Richard was yanked forward, swallowed into the frame. His scream echoed once, then cut off. The painted Richard stood where Thomas had been, alive inside the portrait. Thomas was gone. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Sophie clung to her, trembling violently. Then the voice came, a deep, guttural whisper that rattled the walls. One by one, the family is complete. The painted figures moved closer, their oozing hands reaching. Eleanor backed away, but there was nowhere left to go. The house was melting, twisting into a gallery of horrors. Every wall now carried portraits, screaming faces she didn't recognize. Families from decades past, all trapped, all pleading for release. "This house is a graveyard," Eleanor whispered, horror dawning. All of them were painted here. The painted mother reached out, her cracked fingers brushing Eleanor's cheek. It was cold, wet, and sticky, like fresh paint. She knew what was coming, but before the figure could pull her in, Sophie screamed with a voice that wasn't her own. "Stop!" The room shook violently. The portraits flickered. For a brief second, the twisted figures faltered, their bodies warping. Sophie's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lightning outside. Eleanor pulled her daughter close, realization striking her. Sophie wasn't just a victim. She was resisting. The curse wasn't absolute. The painted figures howled. "Stop!" Their mouths opening impossibly wide. The sound shattered the remaining windows. Eleanor covered Sophie's ears, dragging her toward the fireplace. "We have to fight!" Eleanor cried. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the portrait's frame, clutching it like a weapon. The glass pulsed, hot in her hands, glowing faintly. The painted father lunged. Eleanor slashed wildly, and to her shock, the others recoiled, hissing. They can be hurt, Eleanor realized, her heart pounding. There's still paint. With trembling courage, she stood tall, shielding Sophie. "You won't take her!" For the first time, the painted figures stepped back. But behind them, the portrait still glowed. Thomas's face trapped inside once more, his painted hands pressed against the glass. Sophie sobbed. "Mommy, he's still in there!" Eleanor's heart broke. Her son was gone, and her husband too. But she had Sophie, and she would not let the portrait take her as well. The house roared, walls cracking, floorboards splitting. The paintings screamed in unison, their voices blending into a monstrous wail. The air thickened, pulling Eleanor and Sophie toward the glowing canvas. Eleanor dug her heels into the floor, clutching Sophie with one arm, holding the glowing shard in the other. "No!" she screamed. "You can take me, but you will not take her!" The shard blazed brighter, burning white hot in her. With a final cry, Eleanor drove it straight into the heart of the portrait. A deafening explosion followed. The canvas split down the middle, black liquid spraying like blood, screams erupting from within. The painted figure shrieked, twisting violently before collapsing into smears of dark paint. The glow vanished. And then, silence. The portrait lay in ruins. The house was still. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, Sophie sobbing into her chest. For a long time, neither moved. But when Eleanor lifted her eyes, her stomach dropped. In the shattered remains of the portrait, she saw it. A faint reflection. Her own painted face, smiling. The house stood silent after the portrait's destruction, the heavy air lifting for the first time since the Harringtons had moved in. Eleanor sat on the cold wooden floor, Sophie in her arms, both shaking uncontrollably. The broken canvas lay scattered around them, its black liquid seeping into the cracks of the floorboards. On, disappearing as if it had never existed. "Mommy," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" Eleanor brushed her daughter's hair back, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." But deep down, Eleanor wasn't so sure. She helped Sophie upstairs, tucking her into bed, despite the broken windows and the cold wind sweeping through the house. Every creak made Eleanor flinch. Every shadow looked heavier than it should, yet exhaustion weighed her down. And for the first time in weeks, Sophie closed her eyes and slept. Eleanor returned to the living room, staring at the ruins of the painting. She wanted to believe the nightmare was finished, but as she knelt to gather the shattered glass, her blood ran cold. Among the shards was a piece that still glowed faintly, and inside it, a reflection. Thomas, her son's painted face, stared back at her, pressed against the shard as though trapped within it. "Is Thomas?" Eleanor whispered, clutching the shard to her chest. The room shifted slightly, the air thickening again. For a moment, Eleanor swore she could hear faint whispers, hundreds of voices layered together. Some begged for release. Others laughed. The curse wasn't gone. The portrait may have been destroyed, but the pieces still held the souls. The following morning, Eleanor packed what she could. She refused to stay another night in the house. She carried Sophie to the car, her daughter still half asleep, and placed her gently in the back seat. The engine roared to life without hesitation, as though mocking them for not trying again sooner. But Eleanor didn't care. She only wanted to leave. As the car pulled away, Sophie stirred. "Mommy?" "Yes, darling." Sophie's small voice was weak. "Why is Daddy waving at us?" Eleanor's hands froze on the steering wheel. And there he was. Richard stood in the upstairs window, smiling faintly, his hand raised in farewell. But his body was pale, his eyes hollow, and behind him, dozens of painted faces crowded the glass, pressing forward, watching them leave. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, speeding down the road until the mansion vanished from sight. She didn't look back again. That night, in the cheap motel where they found shelter, Eleanor tucked Sophie into bed. She tried to reassure her that they were safe now, but Sophie clung to her, refusing to let go. When Eleanor finally lay down, exhaustion overtook her. She placed the glowing shard on the bedside table, unable to part with it, unable to abandon the last piece of Thomas she had left. The shard pulsed faintly in the dark, casting a pale glow across the room. Hours later, as Eleanor drifted into uneasy sleep, Sophie stirred, and Sophie's reflection smiled back. But it wasn't her smile. It was something older, hungrier, waiting.